The second question is one that I suspect strikes much more directly at some of the issues that face us, especially today. How can we be held responsible for our choices when each of us is so affected by our environment? Can we really have free will and responsibility when it seems we are simply the product of our upbringing and our surroundings? Of course, this question is most stridently advanced nowadays in certain quarters, especially among psychologists who subscribe to the behaviorist school, who would argue that a human being is simply a product of whatever stimuli have impacted upon us. And as a result, whatever course of action we choose is simply the result, determined by what happened to us. Well, of course, it should be clear to us that this question did not arise first in the schools of contemporary psychology. If anything, on the contrary, we should recognize that it was very much an innovation in the Bible to regard man as a free agent. And the crowning blessing of man, the greatest gift, is the responsibility that God gives us by our having that freedom. And of course, this is something that is emphatically affirmed throughout Scripture. I can't help but note again, Psalm 33, that God forms together their hearts and knows, understands all their deeds, because they all are significant. And moreover, in particular, focusing upon Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, the Torah stresses, neither shall the fathers be put to death on account of the children, nor shall the children be put to death on account of the fathers. Each man dies by his sin. It's all about who you are, not who else is with you, either before or afterward. And this is an idea that, it becomes clear, was especially addressed in the years immediately preceding the destruction of the Holy Temple. An expression that we find both the prophet Jeremiah and the prophet Ezekiel explicitly attempting to combat, is the expression that we find in Jeremiah in chapter 31, in verse 28. The people who say, the fathers eat boser, the unripe fruit that blunts the teeth, and the children's teeth will then become blunted. Why should we bear the consequences of what our forefathers did? And this, in Ezekiel, in chapter 18, is especially forcefully articulated, where Ezekiel presents the self-same expression, and in the verses that ensue, presents to us a very detailed illustration that begins with a righteous man who has a wicked son. And of course, inevitably, we recognize the son in his wickedness is not going to be saved because of the righteousness of his father. Nor, of course, is his wickedness going to in any way blemish that righteousness of the father. The father is rewarded for his righteousness. The son will be punished for his wickedness. And in extending the illustration to another generation, the wicked son has himself a righteous son, that is, the first righteous man's grandson. Again, the grandson isn't going to be faulted because of the wickedness of his father. Each man has indeed expressed in almost the self-same words as Deuteronomy in verse 4, the soul that sins shall die. Only that one. There is individual responsibility because you choose. It's your life and your choices and your autonomy, your free will. So, of course, this is a major principle that we encounter repeatedly in Scripture. I feel compelled to note that you might be troubled by the instances in Scripture that seem to subvert this principle. That is, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, and again in Exodus chapter 34, verse 7, and in Numbers chapter 14, verse 18, and in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 9. In each of these verses, we encounter the idea that God carries over, takes an accounting of the iniquity of the forefathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate God, which implies there is some kind of carryover to subsequent generations. So, do we have a contradiction here? Of course, inevitably. We recognize that in the Bible, when something appears to be a contradiction, that means we haven't dug deeply enough in trying to understand what is indeed going on. So, in resolving this one, before we just consider the inevitable reality that individual responsibility is explicitly affirmed. Again, Deuteronomy in the aforementioned passage in chapter 24, verse 16, and in the verses in Ezekiel chapter 18. But furthermore, it's interesting to note, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, while on the one hand, the formulation that we encounter in verses 9 and 10 seem to be very reminiscent of the sort of carrying over that we discussed in the aforementioned passages in Exodus, in Numbers, indeed just a couple of chapters earlier in Deuteronomy, about the reward going to 1,000 generations and the punishment being taken into account. It's significant to note here in verse 10 that God pays to those who hate him to their face, to destroy them. He does not postpone the punishment of hatred, rather, to the face of the one who hates God, he gives his payment. No, there's no mention here about third or fourth generations. So evidently there isn't any hard and fast rule that the accounting pertains to subsequent generations. Here, it is immediate and devastating, but nothing about it being transferred to subsequent generations as well. Furthermore, when we consider a similar formulation in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 18, I'm going to call our attention to a subtlety in Scripture that admittedly may not carry over in translation, but nonetheless it is in the Hebrew text. Here, the prophet is speaking, and in addressing God, he says, "You, God, oseh chesed la'alafim, do kindness for thousands of generations, u'mishalem avon avot el chek b'neihem achareihem, and you pay the iniquity of the fathers to the bosom of the children after them," that is, after the fathers. You who are the great and mighty Lord, the God of hosts is his name. And I'd like to focus upon the nuance here of the children after them. And of course, ostensibly, after them is utterly redundant. We know that children come after the parents. But the special emphasis on after them is something that we can well appreciate in light of our tradition. And indeed, in our tradition, this is the resolution of the apparent contradiction. Is it indeed only the soul of the sinner that is punished, or is it the third and fourth generations afterward that are punished too? That, in short, it depends on what the individuals involved do. If those subsequent generations continue on the path of wickedness of their forefather, then indeed the accounting for that wickedness is visited not only upon the original perpetrator, but on the generations that follow as well. And the punishment can then last through generations of progeny, third and fourth generations, if they continue to follow in the same course. If not, then, as we already saw in Deuteronomy chapter 7, God punishes the guilty party instantaneously. And of course, again, in this regard, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, Ezekiel chapter 18, and elsewhere in Scripture, it is specifically the guilty party that is punished and no one else. So, of course, to that extent, our stress upon human responsibility, individual responsibility, is left unassailable. Every individual bears responsibility. It's not even merely responsibility for what you have done. It's responsibility for who you became. Because whoever you became, inevitably, is going to be a consequence of what you do. But that's really the crucial emphasis. What do you make of yourself through the decisions in which you engage? And here's where we get to what perhaps most critically is our response to the argument that we are merely determined consequences of whatever has gone into our upbringing and our surroundings and we don't really choose. We emphatically maintain. We choose. It's up to us. But precisely what is up to us? The argument as it is presented, especially again in contemporary parlance, makes a lot of sense. Do we really think that every time we make a choice, it is truly an expression of our own personal freedom? So, let me put the cards on the table at the outset. That would clearly be an untenable position to maintain. To take a very simple, straightforward example as an illustration. I open up the refrigerator and I see that there are, say, two dishes, one beef and the other chicken. And I have to choose whether to eat the beef or the chicken. Is this an instance in which free will come to bear? The answer, probably not. I'll explain the probably in a moment. But in the overwhelming majority of instances, what will determine whether I would choose the chicken or choose the beef is what experiences I had with chicken and beef, maybe growing up, maybe whether my associations with these dishes, the last time that I ate them, were positive or negative, the sort of tastes that I developed based upon the cuisine in which I was raised. Now, of course, these are all factors that impact on the way I make decisions. And needless to add, these are all factors over which I exercise no control at all. I'm not autonomous. I am merely buffeted by the winds of my earlier experiences that guide me to one dish or the other. But I did say probably. How could the choice of chicken or beef be indeed an expression of my free will? The answer, if that choice becomes a free moral choice. Choices that are moral are truly free. So getting back to the beef and chicken. If, for example, what motivates me in choosing one dish or the other is that I know my wife prefers one of those dishes, and I deliberately take the other one so she'll have the dish that she prefers. And I've taken what would otherwise be an entirely deterministic decision, one that would be based exclusively upon factors over which I exercise no control, and I have transformed it into a moral decision that is an arena through which I express my free will. Of course, if I specifically choose the dish that my wife prefers, then it's also, sad to admit, a moral choice, but a moral choice that is undertaken badly. But in those instances, once the question becomes, am I doing right or doing wrong? Then, and only then, am I truly free? Now, it's important for us to appreciate that what underlies this comparison is a penetrating insight into what happens when the decision is one of moral choice. Because inevitably, what happens whenever we are confronted with making a decision that is one of moral choice? Necessarily, if I'm really choosing, it is because, on the one hand, I have a keen awareness of what the right thing to do is. And on the other hand, I have the capacity for self-deception, to delude myself into accepting as right an alternative that someplace deep down I know is wrong. This capacity to accept as right what I really know deep down is wrong is, of course, so ubiquitous that we have a well-established word for it. It's called rationalization. You know, try going into any prison and seeing if you can find anyone in the prison who will tell you he did anything wrong. If you do find any of the inmates who are prepared to say, I committed a crime, I did something wrong, you know, I'm prepared to vouch for that individual that he will never commit a crime again. Unfortunately, for most of us, even if we don't end up in jail for it, the allure of rationalization is often overpowering. And it can find an expression in any number of arenas. When we make a resolution, when we reach a decision based upon our assessment of what is best and what is not, and at the moment of truth, when we need to follow through, we fail. You have a resolution, say, to lose weight, and when you see that piece of cake that's so alluring, your resolve doesn't melt away. Just, it becomes exchanged for an excuse. Oh, well, it'll just be one little piece of cake and it won't make a difference. When, of course, you know deep down, it'll make all the difference in the world, because you used that excuse the day before, and as a result, you ended up not eating anything less than you had previously. Of course, I'm using a relatively benign example, losing weight. But it illustrates the point. That voice of self-deception, concomitant with the realization that I really do know what the truth is, that is free will. Now, mind you, it's important for us to note here that, on the one hand, in many arenas in our lives, even arenas in our lives that potentially do involve moral choice, we may not be choosing freely. Why not? Well, because if it's going to be a free choice, then it must be a case in which I simultaneously hear the voice of truth and the voice of self-deception masquerading as truth. So, for example, if the individual faced with the choice has grown up, say, in a society of thieves, such an individual might not even be able to discern a voice of truth telling him it's wrong to steal. He may have so blunted his innate moral sense that he's lost that voice of conscience. So maybe something like that, the arena in which he clearly hears the voice of truth and nonetheless hears the voice of self-deception as the alternative is if he's in danger of getting caught and he has to decide. So, should I kill my intended victim in order to escape being caught? Or should I recognize that, at the very least, murder is something that I can never justify? And that inner conflict is then again the inner conflict between the voice of truth and the voice of self-deception masquerading as truth. For someone who is raised in an upright, pious family, not only may there be no voice of inner conflict with respect to stealing, not because he doesn't hear the voice of truth, but because he doesn't hear the voice of self-deception, but for such an individual, moral conflict may only arise when he has an opportunity, say, to go above and beyond in helping somebody. And on the one hand, he hears the voice of truth saying, you really should be doing this, and he hears the voice of self-deception masquerading as truth saying, oh, you don't have the time, and you don't really need to, and don't bother. The important point to appreciate is, these two individuals may in fact be grappling with free moral choice in completely different domains. But in that place where the individual hears both voices, the voice of truth and the voice of self-deception masquerading as truth, in that place, each one is choosing freely. There's no determinism. Each one has the wherewithal to choose where he stands, where he goes. And by the way, we should just note, if you ask, how can you possibly deceive yourself into accepting as true something that you know is false? Well, this is actually what we discussed in our last questions and answers session, in discussing the sin of Adam and Eve, that is the internalization of imagination, creativity, is the internalization of the faculty that endows us with the wherewithal to function as creative beings. And as creative beings, we can create all sorts of positive creations, but we could also create a warped, perverted, alternative reality in which the most unpardonable crimes can appear to be justified. That's moral choice. That's free will. And that's the domain in which, again, as Scripture expresses it, the soul that sins shall die. Not the fathers for the children, not the children for the fathers. Each one to him or herself, because it's up to you. We choose. We discern. It is in our hands. So, of course, in that regard, then, when we consider the thrust of question number 2, do we have free will and responsibility when it seems we are simply the product of our upbringing and our surroundings? Our response is, we may indeed be the product of our upbringing and our surroundings as these pertain to where, in what choices we exercise free will. But every human being has some domain in which you exercise free will. And here's the rub. Depending upon how we choose in that domain in which we have free will, we either elevate our choice or lower it. Again, it's not simply a matter of you get what you deserve. It is you are what you have become. Because it is through those choices more than anything else, that we, in fact, are transformed. I should just emphasize one additional dimension here, and this is perhaps, maybe, the scariest point of all. You might be wondering, well, what guarantee is there altogether that I'll be able to discern truth? I have to share with you a thought that in our tradition is associated with the book of Judges, chapter 16, verse 18. In Judges, chapter 16, verse 18, we read about the infamous Delilah, who, after Samson tells her that the secret of his strength is in his hair never having been cut, is described in the Bible as knowing that he had revealed to her all his heart. And of course, inevitably, the question arises, especially given the deceptions that Samson had presented previously, how did she know? And here's the answer. And it's a scary answer, but it's true. Words of truth can be recognized. We resonate with words of truth, and we know when we hear them. So even if we have the wherewithal to deceive ourselves, even if we have become experts at self-delusion, there'll always be that voice of truth within us, beckoning, warning, and demanding. This is an extraordinary gift by God, that we have this capacity to resonate with truth. But of course, as we have discussed on so many previous occasions as well, whenever God gives you a gift, necessarily, He's giving you responsibility. He gives us all that gift, an intellect that has the wherewithal to discern truth. That imposes upon us the ultimate responsibility, because then we need to embrace the truth. And when we do, indeed, we have the wherewithal to actually habituate ourselves in doing what's right. And then, of course, inevitably, our arena of free will shifts. This is an idea that in our tradition we associate with another line of Hannah, Shmuel's mother, Prophet Samuel's mother, in the second chapter of Samuel, in verse 9, when Hannah says of God that He looks after the feet of the pious, those who are pious to God. So what does it mean that God looks after their feet? Simply this: they become habituated in doing what's right. When you guide yourself by the force of making the right decision to making the right decision, it becomes more and more natural. And that voice of self-deception just fades away. That, again, is an opportunity, and it's likewise a responsibility. And that, more than anything else, then, is our closing consideration with respect to free will. God indeed gives us the wherewithal to choose. And yet He gives us not only the wherewithal to choose, but of course, inevitably, concomitantly with that, the responsibility to choose. That great gift is the hallmark of the human condition. That great gift is what puts us not merely in the role of being a reflexive or instinctive creature, but a human being, responsible for what we do, responsible for where we go, and most of all, responsible for what we become by dint of our choices. May we indeed rise to the occasion, rise to the summons, and choose well, and thus indeed make ourselves worthy of the divine blessing. God bless you.